let me begin by giving you a quick overview of what you can expect to see today and introduce you to the main players, in addition to Mohammad, of course. And I can also mention some of the non-players today who played a very important role up until this point, in particular the main supervisor, Andrei Sabelfeld, the co-supervisor, Daniel Hedin in Mälardalen, and thanks indeed also to Magnus Almgren for being a stand-in in case anything should go wrong. And I'm happy to say that nothing has gone wrong, and we have a full committee and opponent for you here in person live today. So let me introduce those fine scientists, and I'll begin by the faculty opponent. Warm welcome to Deian Stefan, who is Associate Professor at UCSD over in sunny California. Welcome. And we have a three-person committee as usual, and I will introduce them as I see them from left to right from my perspective, which means I'm beginning with Professor Simin Najim Tehrani, who is Professor at Linköping University. Welcome. We have Professor Malek Örnen, who is Professor at our partner Eurocom in France. Welcome. And we have with us Professor Benjamin Nguyen, who is at the INSA Center Val de Loire and also INRIA. Welcome to the grading committee. So we will begin today's defense proper with a short high-level overview of the field and the thesis by our opponent, after which we will hand over to the candidate to present a bit more detail about the contents of the thesis, and that part will be a maximum 40 minutes. After that, we will take a short break. So if you need coffee, you'll have to buy it from the cafe just behind us here, around 10 minutes, after which we will resume with the question phase, and that will be led by Deian. When Deian is satisfied, he will hand over to the grading committee for their questions. When the grading committee are done, you will get your chance to ask one or two questions. And after that, we will close the proceedings, and the grading committee will confer at a separate meeting to determine the outcome of the defense. So without further ado, let me hand over to Deian.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. That was way more formal than anything I've done in the last decade. So this is gonna be fun. I'm excited to be here. Partly because I've looked at a bunch of these papers before, and I'm not sure I have much to say about, like, I've done a bunch of work in this field, but I think it's more fun to hear from you. So I'm maybe going to leave with some questions that maybe the thesis answers. I know some of them it does. Some of them I will at least like want to hear about from you. So I'll start with, like, the web is a giant mess, and I kind of liked giving a talk like this where I just start and they're like basically. So it's the middle of the night for me. Like a couple hours ago, I'm just like, let's see what has like leaked in the last 24 hours, and just like a bunch of shit. So like every like I can just pull up Google News. There's like somebody's hundreds of thousands of user accounts that are basically being leaked. I guess the like really flashy one, which I think I heard from you, was the social security number. Kind of like retrospect, like thinking back a couple of days, like a bunch of the students were trying to say, like, go to GitHub and type in your social security number, see if your social security number was actually like on the leaked list of accounts. And it turns out people are doing that, so they're leaking even more than things were leaking. So okay, everything is kind of a mess. Why is this actually happening? I'd say probably because the web was a mistake and we should all stop doing this. But like until then, I think it's maybe like okay for us to step back and think about like what are we actually using and how do we build these things correctly, right? I think like the only thing that I've kind of like come to over the last, I don't know, n number of years working in both like the academic setting, but also building real systems, is that it's really, 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 really hard to build secure systems. And this is kind of like a fundamental thing, and you can kind of like have the recipe for how do we build systems. It turns out it's also the recipe for a disaster, right? So we're going to have apps which by definition handle user data. Otherwise, they're kind of not doing anything interesting, more or less. I guess like there's weather apps which are pretty cool, but probably not handling sensitive information. So those are great. They should be left in. But in general, right, the apps that we use on a daily basis, they handle sensitive data, and they're basically built by gluing a bunch of code together. So if you look at most apps, they're just taking libraries off the shelf, shoving them into a thing. They're calling it a product, shipping it. We use it. It's great. This is basically like what modern software development is. And it's like really like stuff, at least the way what we're going to see in this thesis is it's taking JavaScript code from things like NPM. That's not just like third-party code as we used to think of third-party code. It's really third-party code that hasn't been touched in years sometimes. Often these developers get burnt out. They don't want to maintain this code. It's gross, it's ugly, and it's brittle. So like this is what real things for real are. And they're built by people who are probably not in this room. I used to say like that we should build, like think of building secure systems for the median developer, which also happens to be the mediocre developer, which is totally reasonable, right? This is like the reality of where we are as a field, I think. So like we need to like aim for like basically people who don't want to use computers building the stuff that we use. And they have to ship this code fast. Which basically means that they also have to like, when we think about like building apps, we need to think about our own code being buggy, and we should just assume that it's buggy and untrusted itself, right? So we're basically talking about taking a bunch of untrusted code, writing more untrusted code, and having this code operate on sensitive data. And finally, we're writing all these things in languages like JavaScript, which basically means that we have frameworks and tools that have no notion of what a secret is, right? So like what your private data is at the language level is a meaningless thing. It's just a blob. So you can imagine why it's super easy to actually like leak this blob. Like we're writing a bunch of if statements throughout this piece of code to make sure that it's not leaking. And we're doing this in 58 different places. So naturally, it's really easy to write brittle ad hoc kind of code. And what's interesting, I think, about like what this thesis is looking at is that it's looking at security in two different places. So we have to really think about the server-side code that's handling sensitive data. A bunch of this thing talks to the client where there's more code running, more code written in JavaScript, potentially interfacing with extensions, which is code written by yet other people whose interests kind of like don't quite align with even the server-side developer. And this is also handling sensitive data. Right, so like we have an attack surface that's massive, and it's basically a distributed system written all in JavaScript. So if we look back again, like why is this happening? Well, A, the web was a mistake. Two, like we have JavaScript on both sides, and like JavaScript is basically a dumpster fire. This is a real photo in Belgium, which says something about Belgium too. But like basically the like this is what we're working with. We're working with basically just mud all over the place and trying to like call it infrastructure. But like, okay, so this is like maybe a negative view of the world. It's magical that it even runs. So like, I'm like really happy that, for example, like my insulin pump kind of more or less works most of the time. Like it doesn't sometimes, and like, you know, I get mad at the CEO and want to do things to that person, but like on average, it's fine. Okay, so like in an ideal world, we would burn this all down, rewrite it in functional language, prove things about it, and then things would magically be better. The reality is that's never going to happen. Sorry for those of you who are working on that. So we have to work within the confines of like what real software actually is and how do we make that better. So I think like one thing that we have to basically accept is that third-party code is here to stay. It's like crucial to how we build systems, right? So we're just going to like for real be gluing these libraries together and piecing software this way. So we need to like work with that the constraint that like this third-party piece of code is going to be used. So how do we actually build a system around this thing where this piece of code might continue to be buggy, but like ideally we'd want it to not have security implications when we pull it into our application. Shipping products fast matters. And sadly matters more than security in most industries. In some industries, even in those industries where like if you ship a thing, you will basically instantly get owned and lose all your money. Even in those industries, shipping a thing fast matters, because if you're not basically first to market, to some degree, you kind of lose. So like we have to like work within the real world where developers are trying to get things done fast, which means basically they're introducing bugs. Which basically gets to the third point, which is, well, okay, again, like code will just be bugged. So like what we really have to kind of work towards is how do we build systems where bugs are okay and don't immediately result in us or our secret data getting leaked. And finally, we can't change everything. So we can't say like completely rewrite your whole thing with this new framework, or you should really, really use this tool because it makes security better, because it's really hard to convince developers to care about security and privacy. Partly because it's like this intangible thing. You're like, use this thing, it's going to be better. And you're like, okay, how? And I think like that's a whole thesis on its own, where you can try to convince people that they should actually do this. So then the question is, okay, like they're building software this way, how do we actually retrofit their existing frameworks or tools to make a bunch of these bugs go away, or to catch bugs before they ship these products? So what I like about this thesis is that it's taking both a principled approach, so there's like actually underlying foundations for the practical techniques that shake out. So I'm not going to talk about like exactly the kind of like the application domain, which I think is crucial to actually making things practical. But what I think is that the underlying techniques actually apply more broadly. And I think like it would be really interesting to see them get adoption beyond what the thesis even talks about. So what this thesis, I would say, like looks at is answering a bunch of questions. So the first question is basically, can we build secure web apps by using untrusted, potentially malicious third-party code? So that's like basically what the first chapter looks at, and it looks at it in the context of these trigger action platforms, which basically are more general. Like we last week shipped this product that basically is a tap thing, even though we didn't use any of the tap tools. It basically is looking for events on like one system, doing a bunch of stuff, making requests to a different one. You can encode it in this framework. And then the question is, okay, how do we actually build this where we're using third-party libraries that we don't trust? And the challenge, like with doing it in the context of the web applications, is doing it off the shelf for like an existing piece of code, right? So like that's actually really hard. So how do we build a sandbox that doesn't just break this piece of code? That's actually really, really hard. And like I've worked on this, and we had like a company building this thing for like 4 years. I think what Mohammed's done is actually way more clever, and it works better than what we did. And like all the academic papers out there, like I can go at length, but basically they're all busted. Like their sandbox doesn't actually work. So this is the other thing of like, how do you actually build a sandbox that for real works against malicious code? And doing that right is really hard, and it's really easy to miss simple things because JavaScript is such a complicated language. And the nice bit is there's like actual foundations of what this thing even does. So like you can build a sandbox. We've built a bunch of sandboxes, and we're like, it gives us something. We don't know what. What's kind of interesting about like chapter B here is it's actually saying something about like, what are we getting out of this sandbox? Because half the time when we're like thinking about secure systems, at least like I'm coming from like the bits and bytes secure systems of the world, where we're like, this is a sandbox and it like prevents the malicious code from like touching the outside world. Well, what the hell does that actually mean formally when it actually does need to talk to the external world? So having foundations really matters here. Okay, then we go from how do we build secure web apps to like, how do we actually think about privacy? So the second question that it answers is, can we retrofit an existing application to preserve user privacy? So privacy is like this whole thing where like even defining what privacy means is I would say like pretty hard, but looking at it from let's minimize the amount of data that we need to use to build an app and do so in a way that's actually practical. So like first, like if we think about like, what does that mean? Well, first, like I don't even know what my app is using if I'm thinking about a real application. They're just swallowing up as much data as they possibly can. And then trying to get a developer to say like, well, you should use less data. Well, like, okay, what does that mean? So like what's really cool about this piece of work is it's not trying to turn the problem back to the developer and telling them, so you should use less data, but instead it's modifying the framework so that the app itself is pulling only what it's actually like needing to do its job, right? So it's kind of turning the question of least privilege a little bit, I would say, on its head, in that it's like, well, we're not going to modify like what the app is pulling. We're going to modify the app itself to only request what it actually did. And this is, I think, like actually like pretty interesting to look at beyond even again, the trigger action platforms, because like we're building apps and like honestly, we're pulling a bunch of data because it's hard not to. So it's easier to write the code that's pulling a bunch of data than it is to write the code that's not pulling this data. Okay, and then the last two are looking at things maybe from more of the client side than the server side, and from a little bit from the foundation. So I would say like the third question that the thesis looks at is, can we identify malicious code before it basically steals user data? And it's looking at it in the context of browser extensions. So extensions are interesting because they're things that we more or less all use. They're gross in that we can't just analyze them. Half the time they're obfuscated. They're not open source necessarily. So you have basically like this massive store of code, and you need to say like, is this thing going to steal user data or not? So like we can't retrofit the Chrome like extension system like we've tried for many years to do this. There's like many political reasons why this is going to be like a hard battle to try to do. The best we can kind of do, I would say, and what has like worked with Chrome is trying to analyze this piece of code. So okay, now we're talking about doing static analysis on JavaScript. So analyzing thousands and thousands of lines of JavaScript for thousands and thousands of extensions is really hard, and it's really hard to build a tool that doesn't suck. So here, what I mean is basically like if you think of doing static analysis, and let's say your tool even has a false positive rate of, I don't know, 10%. That seems good, except at that scale, it's really bad, right? So, and it doesn't matter that it's flagging potentially dangerous things at that scale. You just won't look at these things. So like getting the right balance of a static analysis tool that is useful and minimizes false positives is, I would say, really hard. And using something like CodeQL, which we've done for other things, kind of doesn't really work. So most of the time when people are like, we use CodeQL, they really mean we use it because we've gotten attacked and now we're going to look for the same patterns. They don't really use it in an interesting way for actually finding these kinds of leads. So this has been, this is, I would say, like a fun piece of work that's actually trying to use CodeQL and has it in a way where we can find things before they ship. Okay, and chapter E is, I would say, the weird one, where it kind of fits in, where if we think about like, okay, all these things have underlying kind of foundations that we can kind of frame in terms of like either sandboxing or information flow. Chapter E looks a little bit at kind of new, flashy, cool things in the IFC space, namely non-transitive non-interference, and then says like, is this actually useful? And then basically says you can kind of do this all in the classical non-interference world. So it's like not clear what we're getting. But what I'd like to maybe think through is beyond the enforcing this property, which seems like a useful property when we're building like real systems, that you don't necessarily want this transitive information flow property, which we can get at length, and I assume Mohammed will. But like, what does this actually mean for real in real systems? Like, and I don't know how to like completely think about this yet. So like, I might ask you questions about that, but that's kind of where I'm at. Okay. So like I said, it's the middle of the night for me, and that's all I got.
Thank you very much. So now we get to hear a little bit more about each of these questions, I would imagine, and Mohammed's perspective on what he has achieved in the last few years.
Sure.
So the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Mohammad, and thanks for coming to my PhD events. Thanks, Deian, for the fantastic talk. I'll try my best to keep it as fun as your presentation. So today I'm going to talk about how I've spent the past 5 years of my life, or a bit more informative title is going to be language-based security and privacy in web-driven systems. As Dan mentioned, so web systems are everywhere, and because of their complex nature and large user base, the security and privacy concerns also like rising every day. And with more technically, because of like their heavy dependence on third-party modules, so it might be the case that like the entire system, security and privacy, will destroy with only one third-party module. The main focus of this thesis, as also Deian mentioned, is on trigger action platforms and browser extensions, which I'll introduce in the following. What are trigger action platforms? Basically, they connect otherwise unconnected devices and services. I'm talking about IoT services, smart devices that you might have, cloud services, social network, and other things that you can imagine. So the idea is like quite simple. So upon a trigger, the app that you have does an action for you. For example, Zapier is one of the examples of the platforms. And here is an example saying that, okay, so for each of my Instagram new photos, please make a backup in my Dropbox. Or in if, which is another example of a tab, this is something that like it will show up in the presentation later as well, saying that, okay, I want to get a morning reminder about my very first meeting in the office and get the title of it on my Slack. Or it can be, for example, in Node-RED, as another example, it can be slightly more complicated in a sense that you have like more freedom of actually connecting different nodes together via flows, or sometimes via from some other communication channels like shared context and so on. Here is an example of a Node-RED app that actually it's like an earthquake logging and monitoring. So it gets some like recent clicks from like a website, and depending on what's happening in the CSV, so it will filter out some of the non-interesting cases and report it to the user. The key point here is that trigger action platforms has extensive privileges from the user, meaning that they can act on behalf of the user because of the smart information. That was the whole point of having them. They also actually employ the notion of end user programming in the sense that, as they are kind of like wished for, basically anyone, any non-expert computer scientist could easily pick a trigger and connect it to an action, and that would be like the application. But the caveat here is that like any user can create and publish apps there, and that's why like most of the apps are written by third parties. The examples we mentioned of if, Zapier, and Node-RED, all of them are JavaScript driven, with a small bit, with the difference that if and Zapier are commercial, but Node-RED is open source. Just to have some idea about some numbers, if has more than 27 million users and more than 1 million apps running per month. So the question here that we would like to answer is, given the trust assumptions of third-party app developers, what would be the consequence of trusting the apps and how to securely integrate those apps with our system? So I can start with like a real-world example of a smart utility Node-RED application, which targets like SCADA system. So the idea here is that, as you can see, it's like a bunch of complicated flows, nodes here connected to each other. But the key point here is that there are some there's like a modeling and simulation for different water tanks and pumps. So that's basically like transmitting some water from one tank to another one to make sure that like the SCADA system works fine. So basically, the nodes here are responsible for read values from tanks and start and stop pumps, and basically like raising an alarm if anything goes wrong. It's quite interesting because thanks to the feature of Node-RED, that nodes, in addition to the like visible flows that you can see here, they can actually use a notion of like shared context, which is globally shared with all the nodes for this app and other apps. So here, as you can see, so like the tank level, all of those sensitive information is shared in the global context, meaning that any node in the system can be potentially malicious and tampering with those like sensitive values. So they can like mess up with the whole system. So it kind of highlights the need for a fine-grained access control, basically sandboxing in apps so that like different apps can live peacefully next to each other. Another example is from if. So this app is trying to actually like help like the user to get involved with their boredom in a sense. So the app works like this. So okay, it's like Saturday in the evening. I don't know what to do. I want to like press a button on my phone so that my favorite VOD system suggests me something to watch based on my watch history. So it's kind of like privacy sensitive. But the point here is that the code, as you can see here, which is invisible for the user, asks for like a random movie title among the watch list, right? So, okay, I trust like the VOD system because it knows what I watch, but do I really need to trust my IFT or trigger action platform to know my watch history? So what's happening right now at the moment is IFT, as an example, asks for the entire array of watch history. What you can get from this is either I'm in love with Christopher Nolan or I'm at least into sci-fi. By the way, I never watched any of them yet. So, but what it actually needs is the randomly picked movie, which could be like Interstellar, and that's it, right? So that would be amazing if we have an approach to have fine-grained data minimization for tabs, so that like the tab only accesses what it really needs. Another system that we study is like browser extensions. So you might already use it without noticing it, perhaps, like the spell checker that you have, or like the Dropbox integration, or many other things like ad blocker, your favorite ad blocker. We're all talking about like browser extensions, and they kind of like personalize and customize your browsing experience. Similar story to tabs. Any user can make them and put them on the store. So most of the apps there are by third parties, and they're really, really powerful to access your sensitive data and also modify like the web pages. So the question here is, all right, so what should we do again about like the trust assumption of like third parties? Again, some statistics. Google Chrome has more than 65% of the market share, and the top 30 extensions in the store has more than 900 million downloads. Okay. Okay, for any presentation, it must be something related to ChatGPT, right? So the extension here is about fake GPT, in the sense that there has been like a series of actually like ChatGPT-like extensions, in the sense that they wanted to integrate something with like your ChatGPT and make things easier for you. But unfortunately, some of them were fake, in the sense that, yeah, they do something for you related to ChatGPT, but behind the scene, they access your Facebook cookies, which is enough to impersonate you on Facebook. So by simply having like a permission of cookies in the manifest of the extension, they can access to all cookies of you, your browser, basically. And it's quite easy to actually steal cookies in that level for sessions like Facebook sessions like that. At least they can compromise your account and like make it like a bot for likes and comments, or they can also like do something with like advertisement and other things. The Google Chrome source policy is quite strict and very clear about it, that like any extension should be very explicit about the collection methods and the usage purposes, and any third parties that is gonna get the data from users, and they're subject to removal, and that's like the least actually penalty. There's some more if they don't follow it. And there's also like a review process before release, so that to make like the environment more secure for users. This also kind of shows and highlights the need for tracking browser-specific sensitive data flows and extensions. And it's also like very much in line with what it means for like privacy related policies in the extension. All right, so here's the thesis structure. So yeah, it has like 3 pillars: sandboxing, data minimization, and information flow analysis. The sandboxing, we actually presented Sandtrap, which is a way to securely integrate your third-party apps in JavaScript, and the main focus is on trigger action platforms. And the like paper B is actually like an attempt as like a step forward to formalizing how to secure Node-RED apps. Lazy tab, as the name says, it's lazy to pick all of the data attributes from users. Instead, it just gets what it needs. And for the information flow analysis part, we actually have Codex, which is a chain tracker for browser extensions. And the NPN paper is also like the a bit like more theoretical, but with some application tool for policies, information flow policies that are not necessarily transitive. I'll start with the sandboxing part, which is mainly based on the two papers. Stanford one, published in Unix Security 2021, and the other one, Securing Node-RED Applications. Okay, so tap architectures can be different, and Zapier and Node-RED, as the examples of our work, share like the idea of like a single tenant architecture, in a sense that each of the users are completely isolated at the process level, in a sense that for each user, there's like a dedicated Node.js process, which does everything for you underneath. And basically for the apps of the same user, there is a notion of software level isolation. Keep this in mind. We're talking about the threat model of malicious app maker. So this user might be malicious or not. If it's another, maybe like a more economically justified like strategy in the sense of like sharing users' apps under the same process. So we're talking about like a multi-tenant user. So that's why that like the software level isolation is also more important than compared to the other two. The immediate thing after talking about isolation is breakouts. So sandbox breakout means that how I can actually run away from the isolated environment and get some access from the host environment. So here's an example of a real world piece of code that we reported to IFT, for example. So basically here you can see that like the stack is exhausted and the exception, because of like improper exception handling in the sandbox that we use, the exception object can now after the stack exhaustion lives in the host world, and after that we can run anything under server. So what would be the consequence of such sandbox breakouts? So if you have like a malicious app maker under the same process, basically, even though that the user installs just benign apps, the malicious app maker can compromise, trigger, and action data of the benign apps of the other users. In Zapier, the story is slightly bit different because now the attacker needs to somehow trick the user, for example, by name squatting or something like this, to to make them like install the malicious app first. And then the consequences are at least the trigger, the confidentiality of the trigger service and the integrity of action will be compromised, or the other apps of the same user is also like under the threat. In Node-RED, if you remember, so it's like an open source, and basically it's made to be run on the local systems. A malicious app maker can do something very similar to what I showed for Zapier, and also the system itself could be compromised by a Node-RED node. So the question here is, all right, so yeah, we certainly need access control, and sandboxing is a very promising approach, but the question here is how to represent and enforce fine-grained policies that we need on third-party apps and taps. And then can we aid developers in some way to generate the apps or not? So just having some examples of requirements from the three taps under study. For example, if doesn't allow users to load any Node.js modules. But Zapier and Node-RED, there is a need for that. Or for example, in Node-RED, if you remember the water utility system, there's a concept of shared context, shared memory among the nodes, right? So there is a need for access control at module level and context level. But also it can be more fine-grained in the sense that if apps need to actually access some APIs, some specific APIs, for example, like the trigger action APIs, and some other things related to the time of the system, for example. And almost like all of them, if we want to go further down, so it could be like value sensitive policies as well. For example, I can send an email, right? The node, the application can send like emails to people, but what if the attacker wants to maliciously send a copy using the same API, but different recipient, right? So here is why that like the private URLs or private like email addresses matter. And that's why that we need like a fine-grained access control at the level of APIs and their values. Okay. Here we come to risky, Sandra. It enforces, it's actually like a way to securely integrate JavaScript apps. It's like a runtime monitor for JavaScript. And it forces four policies: read, write, construct, and call policies for JavaScript entities. You might think of like other sandboxes, like security ECMAScript or isolated VM. But the caveat that they have is that they're like more like all or nothing, in a sense that there is no like notion of like fine-grained policies there. So either everything is like isolated or not, pretty much. But what we have here is like a structural proxy-based mechanism. So we're talking about like two-sided membranes, as you can see here in the picture. Basically, for each object in the Sandtrap world, there is like a corresponding object in the host and vice versa. And we're talking about like symmetric proxies. So they kind of like imitate each other's behavior. And this is like a perfect solution for allo listing policies at the four levels that I mentioned: module, API, value, and context. Speaking of policies, so here in Sandtrap, we can have actually like two sets of policies. One is like baseline, again, back to the tap world. So it can be like one policy for all the platforms. If you recall, so like if has nothing to do with like requiring modules, right? Okay, so the baseline policy is no module allowed. But what if we wanted to have something like more fine-grained? So here it comes, the advanced policies, which developers or users may suggest for the app or node, and then it will be set by the platform. For example, back to the water utility example, we know that like only water utility nodes should access the global shared context variables, right? So basically, it's like a default deny policy to access shared context for any other nodes, and only those that need to do something with the shared variables, they can access it. We actually instantiated Sandtrap on if Zapier and Node-RED, and we showed how like the policy granularity at a different level helps us with to achieve a secure integration. Okay, so what are the takeaways from Sandtrap? It's a way to securely integrate third-party apps for JavaScript. It's structural proxy-based monitor to enforce fine-grained policies at different levels, and hopefully it works on if Zapier and Node-RED based on our endpoint. And you can see that the malicious app maker is not happening. The next stop is data minimization. And I'm going to present like a brief version of our SMP paper talking about lazy tap. The simple version of trigger action platform was, okay, upon a trigger, do that, and that's something with the action. But queries are something that we can, like the user can actually get some additional source of information from outside, and it can actually access some private data, such as like calendar events, location, movies, and other things. So the idea here is, okay, the philosophy is like this: if trigger with those query information, then do the action. If you remember the meeting app, the meeting notification app, the trigger there is like 8 in the morning, it's time, 8 in the morning for a workday, and the query is fetch some information from my calendar and the first meeting that's happening in the office, and the action is posted on Slack. In if, what actually happens is like this. So here's the code. The assumption here is the tap is trusted. It's like the same assumption for Sandtrap. But now we're considering that, okay, so the tap is willing to minimize and the source code is either visible to the user or the code is trusted as well. What happens in if is first, it gets like the trigger data, the entire trigger data to the tap. Before looking at what actually the source code needs, it establishes the query to calendar. It gets the entire set of my calendar events out of curiosity, and then runs the code. Okay, oh, I just needed like the first location. And if it's the office, I might need title. Okay, it's too late. I already have all of the information. And then putting the action to the Slack. This is what we call like a push-all approach, in the sense that all trigger and query data is sent to a tap independent of the code, which is at odds with data minimization. But what does data minimization mean is from Article 5 of GDPR, I think. It's like a code saying that only necessary data should be collected for the specific purpose the user consented for. But if the approach is a bit different from here, it's like an attribute level over privilege. And as I showed there in the example, it's like a push-all approach. But it doesn't stay here. If is slightly more curious and gets the recent 50 most recent events instead of the last one by default, but of course it can be like configured. Again, here we're to rescue. Lazy tap data minimization by construction. As I mentioned, so the assumption here is that we're talking about like a willing to minimize tap. And what we actually suggest is like an on-demand approach and tool, in a sense of instead of push all the attributes, the tap, the environment itself pulls data on demand from the sources. And the great benefit of this approach is that like we have like data source unification, so there is no big difference between trigger and query anymore. And we can have like multiple queries if you wish. The approach is input sensitive and fine-grained, thanks to the lazy environment supporting like a fetch and access approach. And trigger and query services have like a notion of like a shim layer, basically capturing the actual object coming from the services, so that it can be there. It can exist there for the further communication between the tap and the service. Okay, example time again. So we're talking about like the meeting notification. The approach of lazy tap is slightly different from if, in a sense that, okay, so the trigger event is being sent, and what you actually need to fire the execution is not the entire data. It's just basically one bit of information saying that the trigger event happened, right? What we do here is actually like sending an access token of the data stored in the machine layer on the server side, saying, okay, tap, please run the app for me. Okay, then lazy tap actually looks at the code, and upon the first access of the, here in this example, like the query service, then it establishes the query and send like the information to query and get it and like store it like the object in the shim, and again just like passes an access token to the tap. Then the next time is, okay, so I needed the location of the first meeting. It's going to be like another query to the query service, getting it back. And only if it's the office, the next line would be the title. All right, there you go. And the action. So basically, we just lazy tap only accesses what it actually needs. Movie recommendation app, if you remember from the beginning. So the trigger is like a smart thing application, or like the tap for the trigger. we don't need to do anything with that. So it's just an access token firing the execution again. Upon the first access for the query, so it establishes the query to tract or like the view of the system and get the access token back. And here we needed the randomly picked movie title, right? Since we're at runtime, the random value is not random anymore. Sorry, before that, like we need the length because of this computation. We'll get it back. And then to actually compute this, we know like the index could be, let's say 2, right? And then the first time index is no longer variable, it's like a value 2, and LazyTab can access the movie title that randomly picked at runtime. All right. So a great benefit of LazyTab is it's seamless for app developers. So developers don't need to worry about anything. The app code is the same from IFT, technically. There is also like support for non-determinism and randomness, as I showed, and now we can have like multiple chains of queries. These are all thanks to like lazy runtime for apps. And the technical detail that the lazy runtime comes from the notion of remote proxied objects for trigger and queries so that they can communicate during the execution. And also deferring the computation unless if it's really necessary on the way by funking. So we evaluated like LazyTab in a benchmark of IFT apps. And for example, the movie recommendation in IFT, it needs like the entire set of the suggested movies with all the attributes and some information from trigger, which LazyTab will never use, but LazyTab only accesses the 2 data attributes. There's also like another previous work like MinTab, which is like a pre-processing style of data minimization, and the best static analyzer cannot guess what actually happens at runtime and what's the randomly picked index. So the best that they can do is actually, like filtering out and making like a vector of all movie titles, which is still enough to understand, to Christopher Nolan. Speaking of minimization, we actually achieved like 90% minimization. Actually, like we got like better 95% over IFT, and around 40%, 38% over static MinTab. So the takeaways for LazyTab is actually it's like an on-demand minimization approach for trigger action platforms. It's input sensitive. It supports queries, something that was like out of the reach for the previous work. Correctness and precision is formally proved. And yeah, these are all thanks to the notion of remote proxied remote objects and deferred computation. Okay, the next paper is going to be about codecs. And it's about like information flow analysis in browser extensions. So in the motivating examples, I talked about like the threats, privacy in browser extensions, because they actually like can read and modify like sensitive data of the user, including like network traffic and the web pages. There are some like really nice efforts actually like to make things like more secure and like to aware like users about how things work as in a browser extension. So for example, Store has like browser extensions, for example, in Chrome, has a system of like a permission system and privacy practice disclosure badges. The idea behind this is actually kind of like enforce like the developers to limit their data usage to what is actually disclosed. And also like being very strict about saying that, okay, so if you don't follow it, we're going to remove it from the store. But there is actually like a semantic gap between what is stated in the privacy policies and what actually happens. This is an example. It's called like a theater extension. And this is part of the privacy badges. Literally, it needs everything from you: location, sensitive information, financial and payment information, web history. And the extension would try to suggest some movies on some web pages. Why it needs this entire information? I don't know. But if you want to install it, this is what you see. Why? Because in the manifest of the extension, in the permission, there is none. So they were, I don't know, for some reason, overly conservative, saying that, okay, in the privacy disclosure part, yeah, we need everything. But in their actual source code, they don't. It's fine, I guess. This one is more interesting. So it's like a new type extension. So it will actually like help you with search in your extension. And this is what you can see in the manifest and like permissions. So a search engine modifier needs storage, bookmarks, history, active tab for some reason. Can you guess about the privacy disclosure badge? The developer has disclosed that it will not collect or use your data. So there are some like inconsistencies or sometimes like a semantic gap between what's happening there. Some privacy violating examples that we discussed in our paper. So the first one was like the fake GPT or like cookie stealing attacks that I mentioned earlier. Some other extensions are really into your browsing history. For example, this is like a coupon extension, like trying to help you with your purchases or here is like a discount there and here and there. They might take, this one, it takes the entire browsing history of all of your devices and sends it to their server for some reason. And another actually like set of or classic extensions are like new type extensions, which some of them actually try to improve like your search results with what you actually want to do. Here is one saying that I'm going to change the search engine in the new tab to Bing. It does, but it first sends the search term to another server. On the way, there is another service as well, and Bing. And we should be like thankful because some of them actually don't send it to Bing. That's good enough. That's why we actually came up with the idea of codex. It's called like hardened taint tracking, which we now can actually like, the idea was like to reason about sensitive flows in extensions. And the idea here is behind the notion of contextual flows, in a sense that the flows that we're talking about, like the privacy violating examples of extensions, are actually value dependent. So here's an example from the fake GPT extension. So, like having the fetch client request per se is not harmful. Accessing to cookies, maybe it's not harmful either. The string URL is also fine, right? But what makes like the whole setting like privacy violating is the combination of the two flows from a suspicious URL string to the network request here, and also accessing to the Facebook cookie, which is not among the privacy policy of the extension. So that's why we actually came up with the idea of hardened taint tracking, in the sense that like the taint tracking as it existed, it should be fine-tuned with the notion of contextual flows to analyze them in browser extensions. And we actually implemented using, we implemented codex using CodeQL. Because we can actually like do it statically, and we can track like flows across language boundaries and frameworks. So we evaluated codex on a large data set of the Chrome Store's extensions, around 400,000 extensions with different versions. And codex managed to identify 3.7K extensions with potentially risky and 1.5K classified with like higher risk because of the way that like the contextual flow managed to find. And to make sure that like how many of them are actually like privacy violating. So we needed to investigate and manually verify it to make sure that if it's written somewhere in the extension's privacy policy that, okay, yeah, I'm gonna steal your cookie and okay, fine enough. We investigated like 337, and out of this number, it's like more than 200 flagged as privacy violating, which this number could impact 3.6 million users up to that number. These are some results from the paper, and thankfully, FakeGPT extension is one of them. So the takeaways from Codex is it's actually like a static analysis framework for tracking sensing flows in extensions. And the idea behind is, focusing on contextual flows. And taking a look at what it means for hardened and tracking for browser extensions. And finding some good results for privacy violating verify. Okay. Thesis takeaways. These 4 pictures kind of summarizes my 5 years of living in Sweden, pretty much. In the first, I was talking about like Sandtrap, which was a fine-grained access control for enforcing like isolation at different levels in JavaScript and mainly trigger action platforms. Next, I talked about LazyTab, which was like an on-demand data minimization for and which we instantiate on trigger action platforms. I also like explained briefly about Codex and what hard intent tracking means for browser extensions. And this is basically something quite new because I haven't explained what we suggested for the last paper, but basically it's like a transpiler showing how non-transitive falsies can be reduced to transitive ones. And by using like a flow-sensitive type system, we can achieve like a more permissive enforcement mechanism for non-transitive policies. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. So the time now is 10:58. We will resume at 11:10. So see you back here at 11:10 for the next part. So for this part, you have a much
I think I was asked to no, because I have need to run from one to the about when we send a message. Yeah, because you're looking at
I'm meeting at 1.